Thierry Malleret, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. You are, of course, a very esteemed economist, and you have done work with the World Economic Forum. You co-authored The Great Reset with Klaus Schwab, and you currently have a new book out called Deaths at Davos that I'd like to speak with you a bit about today. But for folks who may not be familiar with you, could you share a little bit about your background and how you got involved with the WEF? And I know that maybe you worked with Jacques Chirac in the past. Just anything that you could share about your background.
Okay. Um, so I'm French, and for most of my life I lived abroad. I started my career as the Prime Minister's office, yes, Jacques Chirac, in 90 for 3 years, and then went to the US. I worked in New York in a think tank, and then I went to Oxford University to complete my PhD. And then instead of doing an academic career, which was my choice at that time, I ended up working in the city as an economist in investment banking. I worked in London, I worked in Russia, and by complete serendipity, I ended up working at the World Economic Forum in 1999. So I moved from Moscow to Geneva, worked at the WEF for 7 years, being in charge of different things, including Davos, the program at Davos, the well-known global gathering that takes place every year in this mountain resort. I funded the Global Risk Network at the WEF, and then I left in 2007 to do my own things. I created a few companies which deal with macro issues, economics, geopolitics. It's essentially a clearinghouse for ideas. So I work to introduce my clients to bright minds who can provide tangible insights that clients utilize for making good investment or professional decisions. That's what I do. And I have also my own event called the Summit of Minds, which is destined to nurture this community and shed a light on macro issues.
So, of course, you're probably most well known for co-authoring The Great Reset with Klaus Schwab. And, this was a very prominent work that came out during COVID-19. I just was kind of curious if you go into sort of what the genesis for that was. How did it come to be that you wrote that book? And did he reach out to you first, or did you reach out to him? How did that happen exactly?
Right. Okay. So, well, Klaus Schwab knows me well, of course, because I work in his organization, but also we stayed in touch after I left. I helped him write two books prior to the Great Reset. One was about Europe, I think a small booklet that was distributed at Davos. I can't remember when. And I also contributed to the Fourth Industrial Revolution that he wrote a few years before the Great Reset. And when the pandemic started, it was in March 2020, we were about to go into lockdown in Europe. Um, COVID was extremely vivid for many people in my region because I live next to Italy, Chamonix, which is in the Alps. And you may remember that northern Italy was very, very badly hit at the very beginning. It was the first country outside of China to be hit with such violence by COVID. There were many, many deaths in northern Italy at that time, in Lombardy, which is a province of northern Italy. And we knew that we were about to go into lockdown. And I was interested in what the pandemic would do to our economies, societies, to geopolitics, to society, because I studied the history a bit. And I knew that every time a pandemic has occurred throughout history, it has been such a massive exogenous shock on the economy and society that it has long-lasting effects. I knew a bit about the Justinian plague, about the Great Plague in the 13th century that eliminated more than 50% of the European population at the time. So I thought, well, we don't know what COVID is going to be. There was a sense of panic at that time because it was very early on. And the idea was to figure out the impact it might have on several macro issues: economics, geopolitics, the environment, society, and tech. That was a very simple idea that underpinned my willingness to write this book. And I remember that one day I was ski touring, which is something that I do very often to think, to work, to write. And Klaus Schwab called me and said, "Oh, what about writing a book? I've had this idea," he said, "about writing a book about COVID." And I said, "Well, I have the same idea." Um, I started to think about it, and we said, "Well, let's do it together." And that was it.
And could you speak about the writing process? How much of the book did you write, or did he write, or did you kind of email back and forth, or just how did that collaboration work?
So I can't remember the exact day, but I think we started to do this in March. So it was full lockdown. We couldn't in Klaus Schwab is in Geneva, which is a few kilometers away from where I live, but I live in France, and in France we couldn't even go out. We needed a daily authorization to walk for about 15 minutes. You couldn't leave your house for more than half an hour. I can't remember exactly the details, but it was full lockdown. So I was working incredibly hard and also peacefully. It was, I don't know how it happened to you, but in Europe, no planes, no cars. The weather was absolutely amazing, beautiful, and hot, so we could be outside a bit. And I write a lot because as an economist on a trading floor, I'm used to working extremely fast to write notes for my clients, for investors. So I started to write, but we communicated on a daily basis with Klaus Schwab. So every day I sent him what I was writing. He got back to me with his suggestions, which I included, incorporated, were discussions, conversations, not very many arguments, none, I think. And that was a work in common. And it took us 3 months to write the book.
Yeah, I know that's been some commentary, especially among people who are critical or have conspiracy theories about the work, is that it was produced so quickly. Could you just speak to a little bit, how were you able to produce? I know you said that you sort of have experience producing work quickly, but especially given the context of the early months of COVID when things were changing so quickly and there was a lot of uncertainty, how were you able to produce this work in that context?
Okay, so very easily. First, I can write without any problem 3,000 words a day. So 3 months, it's 90,000 words, which is more than the book itself. So it goes fast. And when we combine the network of Professor Schwab, the World Economic Forum, my own network, there were many, many people uh, we could we could call and have Zoom conversations with to understand what the thinking was. Health specialists, epidemiologists, economists, historians, geopoliticians, political scientists, tech people, everybody was available because again we're stuck at home. So the way I did it, and he did it also on his side, was for a few hours a day to call many people all over the world, test our hypothesis with them, and write. And you're right. At that time, there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. It was very early on. We didn't know how deadly COVID would be. There was a frantic search for a vaccine um, that came fast, but I think after the publication of the book, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. And of course, we're incredibly aware about our own limitations. We knew little, but we had this intuition, conviction that the effect of COVID would be major because that's always been the case throughout history.
And again, obviously, there was a lot of reaction to the work, and especially among, we might call conspiracy theorists, there was a lot
Yeah.
of negative reaction or concern about certain things. So I just want to ask a few questions about that briefly. One of the phrases that got a lot of attention in the context of the Great Reset is you will own nothing and you will be happy. I know that
Yeah,
you didn't write that. I know that it was Ida Aachen who in 2016 actually came up with that phrase. But again, in the context of the Great Reset, that was sort of put out there as what the gist of it is that in the future people are not going to own property and have to, I guess, deal with a lot less. How do you view that phrase and how do you view the association of that phrase with the Great Reset?
I didn't know about it. I had no idea. Um, and it popped up. I can't remember when, but I think it was a late realization that this phrase was being used because I can't remember exactly when this conspiracy started to emerge. The book was doing well, very well. And then suddenly, one night, a friend called me and said, "Oh, Fox News is talking about your book." I said, "Oh, really? Okay, fine, perfect." And in the morning, I looked at the clip on Fox News, and realized that the sales had skyrocketed because you can follow easily on Amazon, how you're doing. And I knew that the book was being engulfed in this conspiracy theories at that time, but never really paid attention to it because first, it's very toxic. When you write a book which becomes the target of conspiracy people, it's unpleasant. And also, I thought it was a distraction. So these two reasons compelled me not to pay too much attention to that. But then it became so big that I started to get into it, and it's interesting because you realize that you have a common theme with infinite variations around the conspiracy. Um, um, yeah. Uh,
Well,
it,
again, just I guess
yeah, it didn't
specifically,
really surprise me because there are many. Well, it did and it didn't. It did surprise me a bit because of the uh, massive effect and the virality with which this phenomenon took place. But also, it surprised me not that much because there are so many conspiracy about the World Economic Forum, about Bilderberg, about global gatherings. So I think it was an easy target.
hmm,
With hindsight, but with hindsight, it's always very easy to come to conclusions.
right. Well, I mean, I think that sentiment could be understandable, right, for most common people who obviously aren't involved in those global elite summits. They look at things like the World Economic Forum and Bilderberg Group and Trilateral Commission and
Yeah.
Club of Rome, like all these things. These are organizations that they do not, have any real say in as far as they're concerned. They don't have any input in, and they see this as a gathering of global elite who are basically going to be dictating global policy for the global population who doesn't really, again, have a democratic say in that process. So, what are your sort of general thoughts on that sentiment among most people who, just have skepticism and fear of these sort of gatherings of the global elite?
Well, I have two responses to that. So the first, um, which may not be something that the World Economic Forum would say, but I would argue that no substantive decision has ever been made at the World Economic Forum. People come to do business. They come to meet the peers, to have conversations, to do deals, and it would be inconceivable to imagine that such a large organization, which attracts so many people with different opinions, different perspectives, different backgrounds, could be in a position to dictate policy. And in today's world, in which transparency is a fact. Everything is available. It's just impossible to imagine that decisions could be made behind closed doors. Or it's not the case. It's not the case. It's just a very successful organization that gathers people to to brainstorm or to exchange ideas, but the real decisions probably are made uh, on the fringe of the meeting, when head of state meet, or but as they would in any other similar context, when they go to the G7, the BRICS meeting today in Kazan in Russia, surely decisions are being made, but they're not being made um, uh, in the same framework that the World Economic Forum is. It's a private organization, very successful at what it's doing, attracting people who are highly influential. But the WEF itself is not in a position, or doesn't have the capacity to influence policy. It's not
But
the
but
case.
it is a gathering of global elite who effectively make that policy, right? And who probably reflect
No, I
certain
don't think
class
so.
interests.
No, I don't think so. No, 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 no. I don't think they do policy. No, they can't because there are network effects. When you have important people going to one place at the same time, you're of course willing to participate because you know that you are going to meet people important to your decisions. If you are the head of state of Azerbaijan, I guess that you are willing to meet the US oil companies, gas companies that do business in your country, the European companies, the Russian companies. It's a place in which you achieve great economies of scope and scale because there are so many influential business leaders, policymakers in one place at one time. But the decisions are not the decision made by the WEF. The WEF doesn't have the capacity to dictate anything to anybody. And the book, when all these conspiracy theories started to take place, there were conversations, I remember, around the young global leaders. The young global leaders, I don't know how many hundreds of people have been young global leaders throughout the WEF recent history. Young policymakers, young CEOs, young investors, entrepreneurs, activists, etc. And I think Macron was one of them, Trudeau, a few others. And it's great to be a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, but it's not a place where you are told what to do or you make decisions. It's just a huge, gathering where you meet your peers as you would if you had a dinner party with some of your friends who are influential media leaders, for example, at your home, except it's on a much broader scale and much more international. But again, it's a complete fiction to imagine that an important policy decisions could be instigated by the World Economic Forum. And in the book, the book is very super simple. The book, I don't know whether you had a chance to read The Great Reset, but the book basically argues two things, which are pretty elementary. First, we should be more respectful of Mother Nature because we believe, yes, there is an environmental crisis, there is climate change, biodiversity loss, and we argue in the book that the economy cannot function without nature. I think it's a fact, and the evidence is pretty incontrovertible today that if you want the economy to operate properly, you need nature to sustain it. And the second argument that we got up in the book that may be a bit more contentious for some people is that the societies are too unequal. There is too much inequality at the moment in most economies around the world, and this needs to be addressed. So these are the two simple arguments that we make in the book. There are no policy prescriptions, and we just try to understand how the world post-COVID is likely to evolve. That's it. So it's much more modest than what the conspiracy people make of it.
Well, again, just on the environmental front, one concern that you heard from folks was that you effectively were prescribing the dietary changes that folks would eat
No, we
less
are not.
beef.
No, we are not.
Okay.
No.
Well, again, that was an interpretation. So I don't know if you
Yeah,
have
it's
a
an
sort of
interpretation.
response
Yeah.
to that, and because there was a lot of folks saying, they want us to stop eating meat, they want us to start eating insects. So just what is your kind of response to how folks sort of picked up that thought?
Well, my response is that it's very, very, very culture driven, this attitude. And I think people in the US have a very, very different attitude than people in Europe, for example. In Europe, there is a sizable portion of the population that is changing its behavior, its consumption habits because of concerns about climate change. And it's true that you have movements trying to eat less meat or travel less or spend less on a car, these sort of things. Buy more EVs instead of petrol cars. and so on and so forth. But it's a bottom-up approach. You have no government telling you do this or do that. It may be that in the future some autocratic governments will tell you, oh, because there is such concern about global warming that you'll not be allowed to eat more than 250 grams of beef every month. I have no idea. It may be, but thankfully, in the US, in Europe, we live in democratic regimes, and nobody's telling you what to do. You do whatever you wish to do. And it is true that there is a bottom-up tendency among some people to change the consumption habits because of these concerns. But in the book, we don't tell people do this or do that. I think it's an assumption that many investors make at the moment. Yeah, it could be that we'll eat more insects in the future. Could be, as many societies do. You go to Korea, you go to countries in Asia or in Africa, people have a habit of eating insects, as we have a habit of eating prawns, which are not that different in terms of taste. Well, it could be that it becomes more prominent because I can see that it's a fast rising investment theme. But again, it's not a prescription. Everybody does what they want to do. And in the book, we never said, you'd be doing this, you'd be doing that. No, absolutely not.
Okay. And yeah, I just again kind of wanted to go into one major conspiracy theory around COVID's origins, and that has to do with what was a tabletop exercise done by John Hopkins and the WEF and the Gates Foundation in late 2019 called Event 201, where they simulated the effects of a coronavirus, and this was just a few months before Corona broke out.
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree, unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged?
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
Obviously, the involvement of the World Economic Forum with Event 201, that, and going hand in hand with the Great Reset coming out, that kind of, would feed into this belief that there was some sort of pre-knowledge about, what was going to happen with COVID. I'm just wondering if you could sort of speak to that and what your sort of thoughts on that.
Sure. Very easily, and I have a super simple response to that. So I joined the World Economic Forum in '99, and at that time, everybody was, everybody, people in charge of the health part of the program was saying we need to address a possible pandemic because it's not a question of if there'll be a pandemic, it's a question of when. And ever since I started to work at the WEF, every year we had scenario simulations, exercises to think about a possible pandemic. So 2019 has been picked up because it was just before COVID, but I think there was a similar exercise in 2018, 2017, 16, 15, because every epidemiologist, every health specialist knew that the pandemic would occur. It's like today, there are warnings every time about resistance to antibiotics, about another pandemic, possibly occurring very soon or in a distant future, we don't know. And it was the case at that time. So it's not that in 2019, someone said, oh, let's do an exercise because there is going to be a pandemic next year. No, there has been such an exercise, a similar exercise in the preceding 10, 15 years.
So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on generally the reaction to COVID-19. Obviously, outside of just these conspiracy theories per se, there was a lot of pushback around the world, especially in the United States. In Canada, they had the trucker protests, and Australia and other places, there was pushback to the lockdowns, the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates, and some might think that those eventually were successful because, again, those things eventually went away, whether that's, because coronavirus receded or because there was such discontent or like there was a Supreme Court challenge to the Biden administration trying to mandate a vaccination at workplaces. I'm just kind of, I guess, wondering overall how you see, A, that reaction to the COVID mandates, and B, just how those mandates eventually kind of went away.
Well, it's very hard for me to comment on the decisions made by people who made a decision that did not correspond to my decision. You have to ask them that question. Of course, I think any one of us knows people that refused to take the vaccine, that were up in arms because they were in lockdown, that thought it was a privation of their liberties. And I just want to reemphasize that at that time, there was a phenomenal amount of uncertainty. We didn't know what to do. All epidemiologists were trying to favor a cost-benefit analysis, trying to understand what was the best option to take. When the vaccine emerged, 11 months, 12 months after the onset of COVID, they made it very plain that there were risks, of course, like for any vaccine. However, a majority of people, I think, thought that it was a risk was taking for society at large. So that was how most people reacted. Some people disagreed with that, and I respect the judgment, but it's for them to explain the rationale. There were many arguments around libertarians' arguments around the fact that if you had to wear a mask or if you were in lockdown, you were deprived of your freedom to do whatever you like. And again, it very much depends on everybody's definition about freedom. And if you accept the idea that abandoning part of your freedom because you're obliged to wear a mask is a tiny infringement compared to the potential loss of freedom if you lose your life because you're infected with COVID, some people were ready to accept this tiny infringement on the freedom. So again, it's a question that is eminently personal, very idiosyncratic. It depends on each individual. And, we live in a democratic society, so different people have different opinions, and they are, of course, most welcome to express it. I can only respond in that manner.
Well, just returning to the book, just one other prediction that you folks had made was that inflation was not going to increase after COVID or explode after COVID. Obviously, we have seen massive inflation over the last several years.
Yeah.
So I guess, could you just sort of explain your reason why you thought that would be the case, especially in the light of all that stimulus happening? Because I could tell you personally, even in April of 2020, when those first government stimulus checks hit, people just started spending like crazy. They'd started buying Bitcoin and meme stocks and collectibles and swimming pools and cars, and people just started buying everything. So how is it that you folks reasoned that there wouldn't be inflation, and how did you get that wrong? I guess that's the question.
Okay. Well, I don't think we have time to enter the details, but basically we got this totally wrong, as you just said, because inflation did not didn't come from COVID itself, but from the supply shock consecutive to COVID. And the assumption that we made, and being an economist, I made and argued unsuccessfully with hindsight, is that demand would remain subdued for many reasons, because technology is deflationary by nature, because of demographic trends. The world population is aging dramatically. Because of the demographic trends and technology, basically, we made the assumption wrongly that inflation wouldn't happen. And when it happened, there were two teams. The team transitory, who argued that it would be transitory, it wouldn't last for too long, and another who argued that inflation would become entrenched. Well, now the facts suggest that the transitory team was probably right, because now inflation has been vanquished by central banks. But again, you are right to point out that this forecast that we made in the book was proved to be wrong.
Are there any other major things that you thought you got wrong? And I guess, hand in hand with that, what do you think that you really did get right?
Wow, that's a tough question. And I find it very difficult to respond at the moment, because we haven't had sufficient time to look at the consequences of COVID. We're in 2024. COVID came to an end in 2022, early 2023. It's still very early on. I think the prediction that was right and that we made in the book is that COVID would exacerbate the geopolitical turmoil that is engulfing the world at the moment. And there is massive substantial evidence that this is the case. The world is fragmenting, moving from a US hegemon that people saw as benign, others as less benign, but we had a US hegemon in a position to maintain a modicum of stability worldwide. This is disappearing. We are in a very messy geopolitical situation, and this is something that we got right in the book. For me, that not the key achievement, but that's one of the predictions we made right. For the rest, I think it's too early. We made predictions regarding, for example, the phenomenon of working from home. It's too early to tell. And there is a massive amount of academic research at the moment trying to figure out whether we'll be working more from home or not. And again, it's too early to tell. There is no conclusive evidence yet at the direction in which this is moving. Another prediction that we made, but being extremely cautious at that time, would be that technology, particularly surveillance technologies, would the importance would increase, because once the technology is made available, it's incredibly difficult not to use it. And it's almost inevitable that when the technology is developed, it will be used, whether it's for good reasons or nefarious purposes. And yes, we can see at the moment that this is moving in that direction. Surveillance technology are becoming more and more prevalent, and it is a concern that we raise in the book. But for the rest, please give me a few more years before we can draw the conclusions about what was wrong.
Well, just last question in this area before we move on. One of the reactions to the book was Alexander Dugin putting out a response called The Great Awakening. And, you mentioned BRICS earlier, and this is a big story this week where over 30 world leaders are gathering in Russia. And, we've seen BRICS grow over the last few years. We've seen all these countries say that they want to join BRICS. I guess I'm just wondering what your overall thoughts are on that, on this phenomena of multi-polarity versus Western hegemony, and how you just kind of view that trend overall.
Okay, well, that's a topic that I address in the novel, in the thriller, Death at Davos. I think the BRIC is a very disparate set of countries with very different interests. The only commonality is the hatred sometimes, or willingness to cut the influence from the Western world that they were submitted to until very recently. So when you see, India, Indonesia, all these countries are now going alone, that the global south, which is a very vague term, but as the meaning that these countries want to follow their own policies without being submitted to the impositions of the Western world. And you see it at the moment with Russia, of course, the war in Ukraine. These countries are in the middle, and they favor their own interests, and they are very unwilling to be dominated by Western policies any longer. So that's the world we live in. And it means that the foreseeable future is going to be incredibly chaotic because, again, there is no country in a position to exercise effective power around the world. You see it every day. You see it in the Middle East. You see it. You see it in Africa. You see it in Ukraine, of course. So it's a cause for concern. It's a cause for concern, and it means that now geopolitical issues supersede everything else. And any economic issue is about to become a national security issue. If you look at currencies, if you look at health, food, water, trade, etc., everything is becoming weaponized. Every of these issues, every single of these issues is becoming an issue of national security concern. Hence, a geoeconomic world in which geopolitical interest prevail over everything else, particularly of economic considerations. And you see it with tariffs. Tariffs is not a good thing economically. It entails a net loss for the economy at large. And yet, every country around the world is working with tariffs at the moment. So that proves the point.
Well, again, I did want to speak with you today about your new novel, Deaths at Davos, and this is a fictional thriller that you put out, and it's obviously a bit different than The Great Reset or other work that you've done. So, I guess just overall, what sort of inspired you to write this book?
Okay, well, I've written six thrillers. I think thrillers are fantastic literary genre because, contrary to a book like The Great Reset, an essay or an academic book or whatever, when you write a novel, you are only bound by your own imagination. You can open any door and it's absolutely fine. So it's very satisfying to write a thriller, and you can address many issues through a thriller because a novel, by definition, par excellence, is a meta-discipline. When you look at when you open a novel, you have no academic boundaries. It's an heuristic approach. You deal with economics, geopolitics, biology, whatever fancies your imagination. So I have this idea that writing a thriller would be a good thing, and also it's great fun to write a novel. It's very satisfying from a personal point of view, I think.
And your main character in this book, Olena, she is Ukrainian. So I guess just what sort of inspired that decision? And obviously the whole Russia-Ukraine issue is very prominent throughout the book. Why did you kind of choose, I guess, to feature that dynamic?
Well, because contrary to you, I live in Europe, which is a continent that is incredibly exposed to the war in Ukraine. I mean, not in terms of lives and deaths, but the fate of the continent will largely depend on the outcome of Russia's war in Ukraine. There is in Europe a sense of fragility because the whole continent depends on the US in terms of its defense capabilities. And so it's an issue that is almost existential for Europeans. And I saw that addressing it at the Circle, which is a global gathering taking place in Davos, in the book, which is not a proxy for the World Economic Forum. It's something totally different. It's a fictional organization. But I thought it makes sense because you have this unity of place, time, and action. Again, you asked me at the beginning what was the objective of these huge gatherings, like the World Economic Forum. But it could be Bilderberg, it could be Aspen, it could be Milken, it could be any one of these. All the most prominent global gatherings pursue the same goals. So I choose Ukraine because I thought it made sense.
I wanted to ask you about a quote in the book. It says, "In his naivete, the Don had always believed that the conversations held in Davos contributed to the course of history. They didn't. Unbeknownst to the Don, money and influence, and the money and influence it bought was always ever made backstage at the annual meeting." Does that quote sort of align with, does that have any sort of bearing on reality of what's happening at the World Economic Forum?
Well, again, so I want to re-emphasize that the Circle is a fictional place, but that's it goes back to the first question you asked me, or one of the first questions you asked me. All these global gatherings, it's a complete illusion to imagine that they drive policy because people come to do business, they come to do deals, they come to talk to their clients, to their suppliers, to the regulators. So money speaks, and it always does.
Well, there's also throughout the book a lot of discussion around Donald Trump and the prospect of him getting reelected. I guess I want to talk about that a bit, but I guess this goes into a larger issue of where did you decide to make things fictional and where did you decide to pull in real characters like Donald Trump or Putin or Zelensky?
Well, that's the privilege of writing a novel. You can do whatever you wish. And so all the characters are fictional with a few exceptions. President Trump, who doesn't appear in the book, but the core of the plot is around a grouping called Anything But Trump that is so concerned by a possible re-election of President Trump that they want to use all possible legitimate means to prevent it. And that's the core of the plot. And then there is this idea that Zelensky is coming to this gathering of the Circle, and I wanted to place very prominent public figures. Everybody knows Trump, everybody knows Zelensky, at the core of the plot because, again, it's a thriller. It discusses the contemporary issues that are the core of everybody's preoccupations. And the reason I did it is that you are going to elect your president in 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, less than 2 weeks.
Yeah, in less than 2 weeks. And presumably the final decision will be made by a few dozens of thousands of voters in swing states. And yet it's an election that is going to affect everybody on the globe. It's an election that for the first time, I think, in history, would affect 8.5 billion people around the world because the decisions made by President Trump, if he's elected, will be immensely consequential. So that's the plot, that's the core of this plot in the book, and trying to explain the reasons why so many people are concerned or less concerned. Again, it depends on everybody's political leaning, but I thought it's good ground to elaborate the fiction in the form of a thriller.
And again, I understand this is a work of fiction, and there's different sort of reactions to that prospect. I guess I don't know if maybe you could share in reality what the general thoughts are about Trump at Davos at the World Economic Forum. Maybe what Klaus Schwab feels about him. I don't know if he's ever sort of remarked on him or just again,
I have no idea. You need to ask him that question. I left the World Economic Forum in 2007. At that time, nobody knew about President Trump, about Donald Trump. Very few people knew about him. He's been to Davos once or twice, I can't remember, but at least once. But I have no idea about the opinions of Professor Schwab about Donald Trump or anybody else at the forum. And I think they keep it for themselves.
Well, I do just also have to ask you because again, you're sort of you're tied in with this global elite network of all these big decision makers and very famous and influential people. I also would be curious what your thoughts are on the fact that you've seen a lot of Silicon Valley people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Palantir, sort of fall behind Trump and are trying to elect him. Do you have any kind of thoughts on what's sort of driving that phenomena?
I never met them. I never met Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or the CEO of Palantir. No, I have no idea. I guess that like you, I read. Well, you probably have a better idea than me because you are at the epicenter of these conversations. And but from Europe, we read articles, we listen to the news, and it's a bit of a puzzle. I don't know. As for myself, I'm trying to understand what they're going to win, what they're trying to get by supporting President Trump in such an obvious manner. That's the only question that I ask myself. But I can go further than that.
And again, throughout the book, you touch on sort of the discontent that there is around U.S. hegemony and the rules-based order, and you explore that topic a bit. I'm just, I guess, again, wondering if you could sort of discuss why you chose to feature that. Obviously, that's a prevailing theme today. And if there's anything really specifically that you wanted to explore and address within that topic.
Well, I wanted to understand why it has happened with such velocity. Because when I was in charge of the program at Davos, the world was still the Western world, dominated by the US, which at that time very many people saw as a benign hegemon. Of course, some people disagree, but I think by and large, the US was perceived as a benign hegemon. Instead of a less benign hegemon, who could be China, who could be Russia, and many others. And then suddenly the wind shifted 4, 5, 6 years ago. You see the premises of this change. I think about a dozen of years ago, but then it goes very, very fast, and the opinion of the world changes, and the Western world is seen as not such a benign hegemon anymore. And then you realize that we, the Westerners, only represent 15% of the world population, so a tiny, tiny fraction of the world population, and yet we have we had such an inflated sense of our own importance that we saw that our power would last for centuries because of our economic weight, because of our policy weight, because of the weight we have in international organizations, in the UN Security Council, etc., etc. Well, now this is changing all very suddenly and very fast. Again, you mentioned the meeting in Kazan with the BRICS. It's very, very apparent that the world is changing and that a very large portion of the world population and countries are not going to accept Western domination anymore. We saw it with the war, Russia's war in Ukraine. We saw that everybody would be behind the West in supporting Ukraine, and it hasn't been the case. So it's something that I explore in this short novel, but very rapidly. It's a small novel, it's a novella. It's a thriller, but it's a theme because I think it's going to be a theme that will gain more and more importance in the years to come.
Mm. Well,
trade for the West in general.
I guess I just have to maybe ask your personal opinion on this because again, this is something that I think it's been going on for some time, and I wonder if not just the legacy of colonialism plays some effect here with the global South may be looking for an alternative like BRICS, but also, all of the interventions that the U.S. and NATO have been involved in over the years. I think we saw that a bit, especially with the U.S.'s and UK's invasion of Iraq. We saw
Absolutely.
a lot of pushback
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
discontent over that, and uh, that probably exacerbated this sort of trend over time. There's a lot of folks who would argue that the U.S. Kind of instigated and prodded what happened in Ukraine, from possible involvement in the Orange Revolution to announcing that Ukraine was going to join NATO, to the fact that some U.S. senators, John McCain and Chris Murphy, attended the Euromaidan protests and funding, elements within far-right elements within Ukraine, like the Azov Battalion. So they, point to things like that. Do you think that, I guess just personally, that there has been, sort of this rash, you know, reckless sort of behavior among Western policymakers and governments that has, again, exacerbated this situation where a lot of folks are going to be very skeptical and afraid of the U.S. and NATO and Western governments?
Um, I'd like to begin with your first point. Colonialism. Yeah, absolutely. It plays such a phenomenal role in terms of how the global South perceives the influence of the West. And you are absolutely right to point out the hypocrisy of the West in many, many respects. And of course, we don't see. I mean, we don't see it because we are embedded in the Western world. But it's probably the key determinant in terms of attitude is the West. And I ask the question very often to my friends who are Indian, Chinese, Indonesian, Africans, Latin Americans, and they always denounce our hypocrisy. And they've got a point. They've got a point. The Western powers, particularly Europe, has been very hypocritical during colonial times, and is now trying to present itself as being incredibly virtuous. But at the end of the day, it's a question of choice. In which regime do you want to live? In a democratic regime, which is what the West still represents, despite all these imperfections, or in an autocratic regime? And for me, the answer is very simple. I prefer to live in a free country, in a democratic regime.
I guess, but on a global level,
the nuances and the many faults of the West, of course, and there are plenty, as you just said. But at the end of the day, I think it's a pretty binary choice.
Well, again, I guess on a global level, even if there was democracy in Western countries, I think again a lot of working class people may not feel that anymore. And I think again that kind of goes into the phenomena you see around people like Donald Trump. I mean, I think the initial sentiment that people had for him is he's going to blow up the system, and that's a good thing because we aren't being served by that system. But again, even if we were to concede that we do have democracies in the West, I wonder if on a global scale, if even if people are living in autocratic regimes, if they still feel as though they're being oppressed by the West. So it doesn't really effectively matter if their government is democratic, if they're still being exploited by these giant corporations and governments overseas. And if a government if they do elect someone who the U.S. government doesn't like, they'll just get toppled and removed.
Yeah, that was the case in the past, for sure. And that's part of the hypocrisy that is very often denounced by these countries in the global South. Absolutely. And they've got a point.
Hmm.
But do you prefer to live under imperfect US domination or under Chinese domination? It's an open question. Or Russian domination. Having lived in Russia for many, many years, I can tell you that I'm more comfortable living in the West, in Western Europe, than in Russia. But again, it's a personal opinion.
Do you think that there's any sort of middle ground way forward where it is more of a democratic system and a just system where again individuals and communities are more stakeholders in our in our system.
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree with your point. And I'm always struck by the fact that, of course, there is a crisis of democracy at the moment. You can see it in the US, you can see it in many countries in Europe. I'm always struck by the fact that there are some small countries, democratic countries, that are incredibly successful at espousing the virtues of a democratic system. Switzerland is one of them. You know, I live 5 kilometers away from Switzerland, in France, but 5 kilometers away. Denmark, small country. I'm always struck by the fact that these countries are small. I don't know whether there is a positive effect of being small. Maybe you have these economies of scale when you are too big and it doesn't work. I have no idea. Maybe it's a conjecture. But Switzerland is incredibly inclusive. It's a participative democracy. The population votes for everything, and you are responsible for the decisions you make at the very, very local level. Denmark is a bit similar. Iceland as well. So you have many examples, several examples of small countries which are incredibly good at promoting the virtues of a democratic system because it works at the level, and they are not in the crisis that large countries like the US, Italy, France, and others face at the moment. And I think it has to do with the fact that they are good at promoting participative democracy. Citizens are really empowered, and they contribute to the decisions that the state makes, or the government, or the local authorities, by voting all the time, by talking to each other, by being involved in any decision that is going to have a bearing on their personal life. And that's good.
Well, I do know that we're running out of time, and I want to be very respectful of your time. I'm just wondering if you could kind of share, again, anything else about Deaths at Davos that you think are really important that you wanted to explore and that potential readers should know about the book.
I'm going to share it in the sequel that will be published next January. It will be the sequel of the first book.
And you're going to publish that before... I mean, that must be tricky, right? So you're probably writing it based on the outcome of the election?
Yeah, it's going to play a very critical role. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So again, just anything else that we didn't cover that you think is important for folks?
Maybe you'd be kind enough to reinvite me when the second book is out in March or April 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have you back on. I appreciate your time today. I appreciate you exploring all of these topics and, again, going through the Great Reset. I appreciate your time for that. For folks out there who would like to follow you or purchase your book or support you, how can they do that?
They can buy it on Amazon. It's published on Amazon because I wanted to go fast, and Amazon is the only vehicle that allows you to publish very, very fast. As soon as you are done with the manuscript, you can publish it. If you went through traditional publishing, it would take months and months and months. So it's available on Amazon. And otherwise, no, I don't have a social media presence. I don't do social media because I think it's a distraction, and we have too many distractions nowadays. It's very, very hard not to be drowning in the content and the information.
I agree wholeheartedly. But thank you very much. I really, again, appreciate
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. I really do appreciate your time today. And yeah, I'd absolutely love to have you back on to discuss the sequel when that comes out next year.
Very kind of you. Thank you.